I am so pleased to be joined today by Congresswoman Val Demings, the representative for Florida's 10th District and former Orlando Police Chief. Congresswoman Demings, thank you so much for being here.
Molly, it's great to be with you. Thank you.
So where are you coming to us from today?
I am in the district in Orlando, Florida, and it's good to be home.
Let's start with these protests that are continuing across the United States. You recently wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post addressed to your former colleagues in law enforcement. Your message to them was, "What the hell are you doing?" How about to the protesters? As a former police chief, what is your message to them?
Well, Molly, we certainly know what the protesters are doing. If we look at the history of this country since their founding, whether it was the women's movement or the civil rights movement, voting rights, marriage equality, the voices of the people have always been a major part of much needed change. Certainly as a 27-year law enforcement officer, my message to the American people is the torch has been passed to a new generation, and we're seeing people continue to engage in helping all of us do better.
What is your assessment of the way that law enforcement has been responding to the protests?
What I have been very pleased to see were police chiefs, other law enforcement officers marching lockstep with the demonstrators. We've seen those images. We've also seen police officers taking a knee, if you will, in support of the demonstrators. Law enforcement is there to provide protection and to make sure that lawful demonstrators are able to exercise their First Amendment right without any harm. Now, we know that, unfortunately, as we always see, there are persons who have no intentions on engaging in lawful demonstrations. They come to steal or to destroy property or burn down buildings. So the police has a tough job to do right now, balancing the safety of the citizens, but also trying to respond to those who are not engaged in the lawful protest. But what law enforcement always has to remember is that if you are an enforcer of the law, then certainly you have got to follow the law. And at the same time, there have been some images for me as a former law enforcement officer, as a member of Congress, and as a citizen that have been disturbing. And the bottom line is everybody, whether police or not, needs to be held accountable and should be held accountable.
If you were still the police chief, would you be out there taking a knee with the protesters today?
I'm sure I would be there. Let me tell you, building a relationship with the community in which we serve has got to be a top priority. I used to say all the time to the men and women at OPD was that, look, spend every free minute, which I know are limited though, that you can getting out of your patrol cars and building relationships. Talk to our citizens just about what's going on in their lives and what they'd like to see from law enforcement. Talk to the children and get to know the children in the community. Find out how they're doing in school. We started a youth mentoring program called Operation Positive Direction, where we paired police officers along with children, and they were the mentors for children who came from at-risk communities. And so building the relationship and look, enforcing the laws, of course, but also getting to know the community in which you serve and building those relationships that will pay major dividends during tough and difficult times.
What other kinds of reforms do you think could improve relations between police and communities and prevent more situations like the killing of George Floyd?
Well, you got to be proactive. You got to work every day to engage in community-oriented policing type of activities. Because remember, the police are the community and the community is the police. We cannot talk about the two as if they are not the same. And so we have to work together to continue to build the relationship, to build stronger and safer and more effective communities. But what I would like to see is, I know we have approximately 18,000 law enforcement agencies in our country. But how do we affect change? We affect change one agency at a time. I'm delighted to see that America is demonstrating this is not just a Black issue. This is an American issue, evident by the diversity that we're seeing from the demonstrators. But I would like to see each law enforcement agency look at its policies, hiring standards, training that they receive, look at de-escalation training. So you'll never have to go hands-on in the first place. You can calm the situation down with your verbal skills. Look at use of force training. Look at officers who train other police officers, because we really need to have the brightest and the best officers as trainers, because remember, they are setting the informal standard for what's acceptable and unacceptable on police departments. Also, the Congressional Black Caucus, we're involved in several initiatives. There are several pieces of legislation that are being proposed. But remember, the Congressional Black Caucus has been involved in racial injustice and criminal justice reform since their inception in the 1970s. And also, when we look at COVID-19, this public health pandemic, it's also put a bright spotlight on the inequities in healthcare. We know that the overwhelming number of people who have died as a result of COVID-19 were Black and brown people. And so we need to continue to look at injustices in all areas, whether it's healthcare, police misconduct, in education or housing, but we also need to look at legislation and come together and see how we can change things for the better. Also, the Judiciary Committee, which I am a member, is having a hearing next week to look at racial injustice and law enforcement. And so I'm looking forward to participating in that. Look, we have a long way to go. We've come so far in this country. I will not deny that, but we still have such a long way to go, evident by what we saw happen to Mr. Floyd and other cases that certainly need to be looked at.
You mentioned there's some legislation, some pieces of legislation out there. What specifically would you like to see Congress do?
Well, there are multiple pieces of legislation that are being proposed. And when we come together next week, we are going to look at those and make sure that we come out with legislation that is the most meaningful. But what I would like to see from the federal level initially is to have an office coming out of the Department of Justice of police standards and training, where we can look at look at best practices around the nation and develop some best practices as they pertain to hiring standards and training and use of force and even discipline. And also our Office of Civil Rights, making sure that we have a strong, efficient arm in the federal level that will have the ability to seriously investigate misconduct, but also provide necessary assistance to law enforcement agencies to help them be able to do a better job.
Do you have any confidence that this administration is willing to do any of those things?
Our job is to make sure that the administration understands the serious need to do these things. And I would certainly hope that the president and his cabinet and his entire administration are watching what's happening on the streets in America. America is on fire. I'd certainly like to hear the top cop, the Attorney General, play a critical role and send a powerful message as the top cop that speaks to the Floyd family, speak to others who have suffered loss, the Taylor family, the Arbery family, while not at the hands of law enforcement, but certainly racism is certainly in the air there. We'd love to hear from the top cop that speaks to the demonstrators, people who have suffered loss, the American people, and to law enforcement. And so our job is to make sure that they understand the critical need and hope and pray that they would take action in this area. As you well know, we also have an upcoming election. Elections have consequences.
Speaking of the Attorney General, what is your reaction to the reports that he was the one who ordered the protesters cleared so that the president could have his picture taken at the church on Monday?
Molly, I almost have no words really for that. As someone, as I said, who served a full career in law enforcement, someone who worked with some of the brightest and best and most courageous men and women that America has to offer. Look, we were not perfect, but when you understand the job and you understand how important the job is and what law enforcement should mean to America, we're the guardian angels who bring peace and calm to situations. For the top law enforcement official in our nation to take the actions, to order the actions that he did against peaceful demonstrators so the president could have a photo op, which resulted in nothing concrete, no message to the American people, no message that console the demonstrators or the families who've suffered loss, or even the law enforcement officers who are out there, all hands on deck, who I'm sure are suffering from fatigue and other things by now, just like the demonstrators are. No message that was meaningful. The Attorney General has to do better. We all have to do better.
The president has repeatedly called for military intervention in the protests. Do you think that's a good idea?
I do not think that is a good idea, and it just further demonstrates to me that the president of the United States just doesn't get it. You know what I said earlier about the police and the community? The police are the community. They are as much a part of the community as your local grocery store, your pizzeria, your school, your church, or your synagogue. Community is the police. Have to see themselves as one unit. I remember whenever we were having some tough situations in Orlando, I would always call on members of the community to sit down and talk to them to get their help and their advice and recommendations for solving some of the toughest problems in our community. To hear the President of the United States believe that military force is the answer against the citizens that he represents just demonstrates to me he just does not understand America. He doesn't understand policing. He doesn't understand the communities in which they serve. He doesn't understand the American people or the American way. That's not the American way.
The defense secretary also has said he doesn't believe that the military needs to call in, but he's also referred to a battlefield that needs to be dominated. Do you think he ought to apologize or even resign for those comments?
Apologies, and I can't. The best way to fix this is to just don't do inappropriate things and begin the process of healing by bringing us together and implementing policies that treat people with dignity and respect. Because sometimes, apologies sound good, but sometimes they're empty. The best way to demonstrate that you're serious is through your action. And I'm going to hope that the defense secretary just uses the word battlefield so much. Maybe he was just confused, because American streets are not battlefields. And when we talk about gun violence and we talk about weapons of war, we try to remind the public that we do not need weapons of war on our streets, where our families, our parents, our children, our grandchildren come and go and play. So I am hoping the secretary just he forgot where he was and who he was talking about. And military force, it's not the answer. Our streets are not battlefields, and we all should remember that.
You mentioned the horrible double whammy that communities of color have suffered from both the police violence and the pandemic. How concerned are you for the potential for these protests to spread the coronavirus?
Well, we always have to be concerned about that, because remember, we are in the middle of a public health crisis. And I've been very concerned, like most Americans have for months now, about the spread of COVID-19. And so we still have to continue to do what we can, right? We have to practice social distancing when we can. We have to wear face coverings when we can. But, I heard a young activist say something last night that just so resonated with me. And a reporter was asking her about the same thing, about her safety because of COVID-19. And she said, I believe the virus of racism, it was something to this effect. I believe the virus of racism is worse than COVID-19. That was a powerful statement. And just like we've seen demonstrators throughout the history of our nation being willing to risk their life for a better nation, Dr. King and others lost their lives. That's basically what this young woman was saying, that yes, I'm concerned. I have my mask on. I am concerned. I acknowledge that we're in the middle of a public health crisis, a pandemic. But the racism has destroyed so many institutions and people in America for decades, for centuries. Is that not worse? And so it just further demonstrates how important everybody is, bringing everybody to the table. Those who have participated in movements like the Civil Rights Movement, like John Lewis, together with our young, smart, talented, and energetic young activists who get it. And they're working, doing what they can do to make our country better. And so, yes, we are concerned about COVID-19, but we're also concerned, as this young woman said, about the virus of racism.
You were one of the House impeachment managers, seems like a lifetime ago, but just a few months ago, helping to make the argument that President Trump's actions with regard to Ukraine were a threat to the rule of law. Do recent events increase your concern about that? And do you believe that American democracy might be in danger?
Well, let me say this. I was absolutely honored, as you can imagine, to be one of 7 persons chosen to be an impeachment manager. Especially having a law enforcement background. Molly, I cannot tell you the political party of the majority of the men and women I worked with at the police department, because it didn't matter. What mattered was we had a mission to make Orlando a safe city, to protect and serve, and we were all focused on that. As an impeachment manager, our job was to uphold the rule of law, protect the Constitution, and protect our precious democracy that allows us to be the amazing country that we are. We presented an overwhelming case that the president had abused his power to undermine the rule of law, to totally disregard the Constitution, and basically throw our democracy out the window. We were able to present an overwhelming case. We certainly couldn't control the end of the story with what the Senate decided to do, but we did our jobs. And every time I hear about the ineffective response to COVID-19, I think about the US Senate. And every time I look at what's going on, the civil unrest on our streets, I think about the US Senate and the president's inability to lead during both of those crises. I think about the US Senate failing to hold him accountable because they couldn't see past him or past themselves to what they were really elected to do, and that's to uphold the rule of law, protect our Constitution and our democracy. Certainly, I am troubled and worried about moving forward under this president. He has not demonstrated that he has any regard for what makes America a great nation. He likes to talk about America being great. I think his definition of what that means is totally different from what really makes America great. And so, yes, I am worried. I am very concerned, and very focused on our election in November. There has to be a change.
So speaking of that November election, recent events have increased the calls for Joe Biden to perhaps select a woman of color as his running mate. Do you agree with those calls?
Molly, I trust Joe Biden to select the person that he feels can best push forward a people's agenda. If Vice President Biden decides to select a woman of color, it will be because a woman of color is the person that he saw as the most capable and most qualified for the times that we are in. And so I don't believe, is it time for a woman? Surely it's time for a woman to be on the ticket. But I trust the vice president to make the best decision, because we are in strange times. We're in troubling times, and they're bigger than this unrest that we're seeing in the streets. We see injustices in all things. We just talked about protecting our democracy. He needs to have the best partner moving forward to help protect this country in a lot of different ways. And so we'll see what he does.
Do you think you would be the best partner for Joe Biden moving forward?
What I do know is that based on my upbringing, the daughter of a maid and a janitor, I surely understand what a large percentage of Americans are going through every day when they're just struggling to make ends meet. Having worked as a social worker, working with broken families and broken children, I certainly understand the effects of an unjust system and how they affect families throughout this nation. As a law enforcement officer, I've seen it firsthand when people were in trouble and struggling, and crime in certain communities and the social ills that cause crime in those communities in the first place. And now, I've enforced the laws, and now I write the laws. Having the ability as a law enforcer to see the vulnerabilities of our laws, and now writing the laws and see where change is very well needed. What I do know is if I am selected, that I will bring real life, on the ground, on the street experience from my upbringing to now as a member of Congress to the table to help Joe Biden solve some of America's toughest problems. And I'll work hard beside him to do that.
Do you think that Joe Biden has been visible and active enough in this situation?
I really think he has. I mean, we've already talked about we're in the middle of a public health crisis. And just like we're having this interview here today, I would much rather be face to face and us sitting down, across from each other, having this conversation. We cannot do that because we're being responsible. So we're doing it virtually. And Joe Biden has certainly given some extremely powerful messages to the American people, whether it was COVID-19 or police misconduct, and what our future really should look like. And so he's taken the opportunity to use the tools that he has available in a very responsible way to provide much needed leadership, because we certainly don't have it coming out of the White House. He is certainly not the president of the United States, but in the absence of leadership, good people rise. And so he's certainly been visible through virtually, and we've heard the messages that America so desperately need to hear right now. And you know why we have every faith and confidence in him? My husband likes to say the best indicator of future performance is to look at past performance. We've seen Joe Biden deal with tough issues before. Many of them, what we're dealing with now at the very core. We expect that he will continue to be true to his word and do the same thing again to bring us out of the wilderness, because I really feel like that's where we are right now.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's such a dark moment right now, filled with so much pain and anguish. Is there anything that gives you hope right now?
There is. And America was founded on hopes and dreams, right? Not what we were, but what we could be. And we're continuing to strive for that more perfect union. Those words could not be better said, because we see that it's an ever-ending process to get where, a never-ending process to get where we need to be. But I do believe that out of the ashes, good things can rise. And I have hope when I look at the demonstrators, when I see Black, whites, Hispanics, Asians, men, women, all there together. As I said earlier, this is not just a Black issue. They get it, that this is an American issue. And everybody's affected. When we see unjust behavior or unjust practices, everybody is affected by that. What Dr. King said is, what affects one directly affects all of us indirectly. And so I do feel hopeful because of what I'm seeing every day. And while, of course, I'm concerned about those who would prefer to come out and break the law, the good always outweighs the bad. And I do believe good always wins. And I'm so proud of the demonstrators that I've seen and the diversity among the ranks.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Congresswoman Val Demings, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Take care.